Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in again. Tonight, we're jumping into some unsettling, true horror stories that'll make you think twice about everyday encounters. So get comfortable, or maybe not too comfortable, and let's get started.
I used to work the late-night shift at a 24-hour McDonald's in a rough part of town. We got all kinds of people, especially after the bars closed. Drunk groups, rowdy teenagers, and the occasional oddball. But one night, things took a turn I wasn't expecting. It was a Wednesday, so it wasn't as busy as the weekends. I was working the counter with one other guy, Chris, while the kitchen staff cleaned up. Around 1 a.m., a man walked in. He was probably in his late 40s, scruffy, wearing an old hoodie that looked like it hadn't been washed in months. At first glance, he didn't seem dangerous, just another late-night customer. He ordered a coffee, and while I got it ready, I noticed he was staring at me. Not in a casual way, but really staring. His eyes didn't leave me for a second, and it was making me uncomfortable. I handed him the coffee, hoping he'd just take it and leave. Instead, he stood there at the counter, sipping it slowly, still watching me. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just tired or out of it. But after about 10 minutes, he was still there, leaning against the counter and staring. I asked him if he needed anything else, and he just smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was more like he knew something I didn't. Chris noticed something was up and came over to see if I was okay. The guy immediately shifted his gaze to Chris, then back to me. He mumbled something under his breath, but I couldn't make it out. I decided to go to the back and pretend to do some cleaning, hoping he'd leave if I wasn't around. But when I came back out a few minutes later, he was still there. This time, he had moved to one of the tables near the counter, his eyes tracking my every move. It was starting to creep me out. Around 2 a.m., we locked the doors for a deep clean before the breakfast crowd rolled in. I thought the guy had left, but when I looked up from the register, I saw him standing outside, staring through the glass. He wasn't even trying to hide it. He just stood there, watching me. I told Chris we needed to call the police, but he shrugged it off, saying the guy was probably just high or drunk. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really wrong. I went to the back again, trying to shake the unease. That's when I heard a faint tapping on the back door, the one we use for deliveries. My stomach dropped. I slowly made my way toward the door, and sure enough, there he was, peering through the small window. His face was twisted into that same unsettling smile. He waved at me like we were old friends. I froze. How the hell did he get around to the back so quickly? I grabbed my phone and called the police, telling them there was a guy harassing us at work. They said they'd send someone over, but it might take a while because of a shift change. The guy didn't move. He just stood there, tapping on the glass, grinning. Chris came to the back and saw him too. That's when he finally realized this wasn't just some harmless weirdo. We both stayed in the back, waiting for the cops. After what felt like forever, we saw the flashing lights of a patrol car pulling into the lot. The guy must have seen them too because, without warning, he bolted into the darkness. The cops searched the area but didn't find him. I don't know what that guy wanted, but I never worked another night shift alone after that. I kept wondering what would have happened if he had found a way inside. I've worked as a night stalker at a grocery store for the past couple of years. Most nights are uneventful. Just me and a couple of other people restocking the shelves while the store is closed. It's quiet, and the hours drag on, but it's usually safe, except for that one night. It was about 3 a.m., and I was in the cereal aisle, stocking boxes on the top shelf. We had a policy of keeping the doors locked after closing, but sometimes customers would knock, thinking we were open 24/7. I heard a faint knocking at the front door, but since we're not supposed to open up for anyone, I ignored it. A few minutes later, the knocking turned into banging. I walked over to the front of the store to see who it was. Through the glass doors, I could make out a man standing there. He looked normal enough, mid-30s, dressed in a jacket and jeans. but he had this wild look in his eyes. I shouted through the glass that we were closed, and he needed to come back in the morning. He didn't respond, just kept staring at me, his fist still pressed against the glass. I turned to go back to my work, but then I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. The sound of glass shattering. I whipped around and saw the man smashing the door with a rock. Panic surged through me. I called out to the other 2 workers, and we ran to the break room to grab the phone and call the police. The guy was yelling now, something about how he needed to get inside. His words were slurred, and I could tell he wasn't in his right mind. As we locked ourselves in the break room, I heard the man's footsteps echoing through the aisles. He was inside. I could hear him knocking things off shelves, his heavy breathing getting closer. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear the police dispatcher telling me to stay put. Then the footsteps stopped right outside the break room door. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't try to get in. The doorknob rattled, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. There was nothing between us but a flimsy lock. I mouthed to my coworkers to stay quiet. After what felt like an eternity, we heard the sound of sirens. The guy must have heard them too because he took off. When the police finally got there, they found him hiding behind the dumpster out back, covered in cuts from the broken glass. They arrested him, and it turns out he was on something. Drugs, alcohol, I don't know. All I know is, I never felt safe in that store again. I've been working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour convenience store for a while now. Most nights are quiet, but we get the occasional weird customer. Usually it's just people looking for snacks or cigarettes at 3 a.m. But one night, it was something much worse. It was a Tuesday around 2 a.m., and I was working alone. A few regulars had come in, grabbed their stuff, and left. The store was empty, so I was just standing behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed a car pull into the parking lot. The guy didn't get out right away. He just sat there with the engine running. I watched him for a few minutes, waiting to see if he'd come in, but he didn't move. I figured he was just taking a break, maybe talking on the phone or something, so I went back to my phone. A few minutes later, I looked up again, and the car was still there. The engine was off now, but the guy hadn't come in. It was starting to feel weird. I stepped out from behind the counter to get a better look, and that's when I saw him. He wasn't in the car anymore. He was standing just outside, staring through the window. I didn't know how long he'd been watching me. I waved at him, trying to be polite, but he didn't react. He just kept staring. I told myself he was probably just drunk or high, but there was something about the way he was standing there that made my skin crawl. Finally, he opened the door and came inside. He didn't go to any of the aisles. He didn't even look around. He just walked straight toward the counter, his eyes locked on me the entire time. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets, staring at me with this intense look in his eyes. I started to feel genuinely scared. "Are you buying anything or—" Still nothing. I reached for my phone under the counter, ready to call the cops, when he finally spoke. "I've been watching you." I froze. My heart started racing. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Excuse me? I've been watching you every night. You're always here, alone." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if he was messing with me or if I was in serious danger. Before I could react, he turned and walked out of the store, getting back into his car. He sat there for a few more minutes before finally driving off. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was long gone. They said there wasn't much they could do unless he came back, but that didn't make me feel any better. Every night after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me. I used to work at a 24-hour gas station in a pretty quiet area. The night shifts were long, but I liked the solitude. Most nights it was just me, a couple of regulars, and the occasional traveler stopping for gas. But one night, I had an encounter that still makes my skin crawl. It was around 1 a.m. on a Wednesday. The station was dead, not a car in sight. I was behind the counter, zoning out, when a man walked in. He didn't say a word, didn't even look at the shelves. He just walked straight to the counter. He was tall, wearing a long coat, his hands stuffed into his pockets. He had a hood pulled low over his face, so I couldn't really see him clearly. I greeted him, asking if he needed help, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, breathing heavily. After a few awkward seconds, I asked again, "Can I help you?" Nothing. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. At this point, I was starting to feel uneasy. I could see his chest rising and falling, his breathing loud and labored. I couldn't tell if he was on something or if he was just trying to intimidate me, but either way, it was working. I reached for the phone under the counter, trying to be discreet, when he suddenly leaned forward, placing both hands on the counter. "You're alone, aren't you?" he said, his voice low and raspy. My heart started pounding. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded slightly, keeping my eyes on the phone. "You shouldn't be alone." He stood up straight again, staring down at me for what felt like an eternity, before he finally turned and walked out of the store. I watched him through the windows as he disappeared into the darkness, not getting into a car, just walking away into the night. I called the police, but they didn't find him. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere close, watching me. I used to work the night shift at a McDonald's off the highway. It was mostly truckers or night owls who came in, and usually nothing too out of the ordinary happened. But there was one night I'll never forget. It was around 3 a.m., and we were in the final stretch before breakfast started. The place was empty, except for me and one other coworker, Emily, who was cleaning the dining area. I was behind the register, zoning out when I noticed a guy standing at the counter. I didn't hear him come in, which was weird because the door makes a loud ding every time it opens. The guy looked disheveled, like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were dirty, and his eyes were bloodshot. He didn't say anything, just stared at the menu for what felt like forever. I asked if he was ready to order, but he didn't respond. He just kept looking at the board. I was about to ask again when Emily came over. She asked if the guy was okay, and I just shrugged. We both waited, but he didn't move, didn't speak. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he pointed to a combo meal. I rang it up, gave him his total, and he handed me a crumpled up $20. I put the money in the register and turned around to grab his drink, but when I turned back, he was gone, just like that. The guy had vanished. I looked around, thinking maybe he went to the bathroom, but there was no sign of him. Emily checked the dining area and the parking lot, but he was nowhere to be found. The doors were still closed, and the only way out was the door he came through. But we didn't hear it open again. I checked the security cameras the next day out of curiosity. The footage showed him walking up to the counter, standing there for a while. But then, nothing. No footage of him leaving, no footage of him going to the bathroom, just him standing there and then gone. To this day, I have no idea who that guy was or how he just disappeared. But after that, I started dreading the late-night shifts. Working the graveyard shift at a grocery store isn't as boring as you might think. There's something eerie about stocking shelves in a huge, empty store at 2 a.m. You hear every little noise, every creak, and you can't help but feel like someone's watching you. Most of the time, it's just your imagination. But not always. This happened about a year ago, during a particularly slow shift. I was working alone in the frozen foods aisle when I heard the distinct sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just the echo of my own steps. But then it happened again. This time, the footsteps were closer. I whipped around, but again, no one. My heart started racing, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I went to the front of the store to check the security monitors, and that's when I saw him. There was a man, maybe in his mid-40s, dressed in a hoodie and jeans, walking slowly through the aisles. He wasn't shopping, he was just walking, and every once in a while, he'd stop and stare at something for a few minutes, then move on. But the weirdest part? He never picked anything up, and he never came to the front. I grabbed the phone and called my manager, who told me to keep an eye on the guy but not to confront him. So I waited, watching the monitors as the guy moved closer and closer to the back of the store, right where I had been stocking shelves. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a box cutter from the back room and decided to make my presence known. I walked up to the guy, pretending to stock some shelves nearby, and said, "Can I help you find something?" He didn't even look at me, just kept walking, his eyes fixed ahead. It was like I didn't exist. I watched as he turned down another aisle, heading toward the back of the store. My heart was pounding. Something about him was off. Really off. I decided to follow him at a distance, but when I got to the back aisle, he was gone. I checked every aisle, every corner, even the employee-only areas, but there was no trace of him. He had completely vanished. The store was locked, and there was no way out except through the front doors, which I had been watching the whole time. I never saw him again, but I started dreading the night shift after that. It felt like something, or someone, was always lurking just out of sight. I work the night shift at a gas station in a quiet rural town. Usually it's pretty uneventful, just a few regulars, maybe a trucker passing through. But one night, something happened that made me reconsider my safety during those shifts. It was around 2 a.m., and I was sitting behind the counter, scrolling through my phone to kill time. The station was dead, as usual, when a car pulled into the lot. It wasn't anything unusual, just an old beat-up sedan. The guy got out, wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face, and walked inside. At first, I didn't think much of it. People who stop by at this time of night don't usually want to chat. But there was something about the way this guy moved that put me on edge. He didn't go for the drinks or snacks like most people. He just walked straight up to the counter, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Hey," he muttered, not making eye contact. "Hey," I replied, already feeling a little uneasy. "What can I do for you?" Instead of answering, he pulled out a gun. My heart dropped. I've heard of gas stations getting robbed before, but I never thought it would happen to me. "Empty the register," he growled, waving the gun at me. I didn't hesitate. I opened the drawer and started pulling out the cash, my hands shaking. He grabbed the money, stuffing it into a plastic bag he'd brought with him. "Don't move," he said, backing toward the door. As he left, I thought about hitting the silent alarm, but the way he looked at me, like he wouldn't hesitate to come back and finish the job, stopped me. I let him walk out, my heart still racing. I called the cops as soon as he was gone, but they didn't get there for another 15 minutes. By that time, he was long gone. They checked the security footage, but his face was covered the whole time. I quit that job a week later. It just wasn't worth it anymore. I worked the night shift at a 24-hour pharmacy for a while. Most of the time it was quiet, just a few late-night customers picking up prescriptions or grabbing snacks. But one night, I had an experience that still makes my skin crawl. It was around 1 a.m., and the store was completely empty. I was stocking shelves near the back when I heard the bell on the front door ring. I walked up to the counter and saw a man standing there. He was tall, wearing a long coat and a baseball cap, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to be polite. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at me with this blank expression. After a few seconds, he mumbled something under his breath, but I couldn't make it out. "I'm sorry, what was that?" I asked, leaning in a little closer. "I've seen you before," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt a chill run down my spine. I don't think so, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Do you need to pick up a prescription? He ignored my question and took a step closer to the counter. I've been watching you, every night. My heart started racing. I tried to stay calm, but something about the way he was looking at me made my skin crawl. I think you have the wrong person, I said, forcing a smile. I just started working here. He smiled, a slow, creepy smile that sent a wave of panic through me. No, he said softly. It's you. I didn't know what to do. I glanced at the phone, wondering if I should call the police, but before I could make a move, he turned and walked out of the store. I watched him through the windows as he walked across the parking lot, disappearing into the shadows. My hands were shaking and I immediately locked the doors. I never saw him again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me. After that, I started working day shifts only. I wasn't going to take any more chances. So I used to work the night shift at a McDonald's drive-thru. Pretty boring most of the time, just a few random customers trickling in between midnight and 4 a.m. But one night, something happened that still makes me uneasy. It was around 2 a.m., and I was working the drive-thru alone. My coworker, Jessica, was cleaning up in the back, so it was just me at the front counter and the window. The night had been pretty slow, and I was starting to get a little too comfortable, zoning out between orders. Suddenly, I heard the ding of a car pulling up to the speaker. "Welcome to McDonald's. What can I get for you?" I asked. There was a long pause before a voice crackled over the speaker. "I'm not here to order," the guy said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm here for you." I laughed it off, thinking it was just a joke. We get pranksters all the time during the night shift. "Haha, yeah, okay. You want fries with that?" "No," he replied, and his voice got weirdly serious. "I've been watching you for a while. Now I've dealt with drunk people, stoned people, and every kind of weird customer you can imagine. But this was different." My heart started racing. I glanced over at the cameras, but I couldn't see the car clearly. It was parked too far back from the speaker. "I'm gonna have to ask you to leave if you're not ordering," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The guy didn't say anything. The silence on the other end was unnerving, and I felt like he was still there, watching me through the camera. After what felt like forever, I heard the car slowly pull forward. I stepped over to the window, trying to keep my cool, and sure enough, a beat-up sedan pulled up. The guy inside looked scruffy, long hair, beard, and his eyes. Something about his eyes freaked me out. He stared at me for a long time, not saying a word. I didn't know what to do. I glanced back to see if Jessica was still in the back, but she hadn't noticed anything yet. I turned back to the guy and said, "Look, if you're not ordering anything, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." That's when he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you see in horror movies right before something terrible happens. "You should lock your windows," he said, and then, without another word, he drove off. I slammed the drive-thru window shut and immediately locked it. I was shaking. Jessica came up front, asking what was wrong, and I told her everything. She thought I was overreacting, but I knew that guy wasn't just messing around. I called the police, but they didn't do much. Just said they'd keep an eye out. I never saw the guy again, but after that, I made sure every window and door was locked during my shifts. I wasn't taking any chances. This happened about a year ago when I worked the night shift at a 24-hour grocery store. The store was usually pretty dead between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., except for the occasional night owl or trucker passing through. Most nights, I was alone in the front, ringing up customers and restocking shelves when things got slow. I never thought anything would happen, until one night it did. It was a little after 1 a.m., and I was restocking some canned goods when I noticed a man lingering near the entrance. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was waiting for a ride or just deciding whether he needed something. But after about 10 minutes, he still hadn't come in, and he was just standing there, staring at me through the sliding glass doors. I felt a weird twinge of unease. The guy was tall, scruffy-looking, wearing a dirty hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. After what felt like forever, he finally stepped inside, moving slowly toward the aisles. I went back to the register, trying to act normal, but my heart was racing. The guy wandered around the store, picking up random items and putting them back, like he wasn't really shopping. Every time I looked up, he was in a different part of the store, but I could feel his eyes on me. After about 20 minutes of this, he finally came up to the counter with a single bottle of water. He didn't say a word as I rang him up, just stared at me with this unsettling smile. I tried to stay professional, handing him his change, but my hands were shaking. "Have a good night," I said, hoping he would just leave. But instead of walking out, he leaned in close, way too close for comfort, and whispered, "You're here alone, aren't you?" My blood ran cold. I didn't know how to respond. Before I could say anything, he grabbed his water and walked out the door, still smiling. I locked the doors immediately after he left, but I spent the rest of my shift jumping at every little noise, terrified that he might come back. The next night, I asked my manager if I could switch to the day shift. There was no way I was ever working alone at night again. I've been working night shifts at a gas station for a few years now. You see a lot of weird stuff when you're the only one around at 3 a.m., but there's one night that still haunts me. It was a typical Tuesday, dead as usual. The station was right off a highway exit, so we'd get the occasional trucker, but mostly, it was quiet. I was sitting behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, when a beat-up truck pulled into the lot. The guy who stepped out looked rough. Greasy hair, unshaven, wearing torn-up clothes. He walked inside without saying a word and started pacing the aisles. I watched him from behind the counter, wondering if he was just killing time, or if he was going to steal something. After a few minutes, he came up to the counter with a pack of gum and a bag of chips. As I rang him up, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "You work here all night, huh?" I nodded, trying to keep things professional. "Yep, all night." He didn't say anything else, just stared at me with this weird grin on his face. I handed him his change, and he left without another word. I thought that was the end of it. But about 15 minutes later, I heard footsteps outside. I looked up, and there he was, standing by the door, staring at me through the glass. My heart started pounding. I pretended not to notice him and went back to my phone, but I could feel his eyes on me. After a few minutes, he left, but the whole thing had me on edge. I locked the door and spent the rest of my shift constantly checking the cameras, just waiting for him to come back. He never did, but I quit that job soon after. I couldn't shake the feeling that next time, he wouldn't just stand there. I used to work the night shift at a 24-hour pharmacy, and usually, it was pretty quiet. Most of the customers were picking up late-night prescriptions or grabbing snacks on their way home from the bar. But one night, something happened that made me rethink my job. It was around 1:30 a.m., and I was alone behind the counter. My coworker was in the back sorting through some inventory. The store was completely empty when a guy walked in. He looked normal enough, clean clothes, short hair, nothing that really stood out. But there was something about his eyes that immediately put me on edge. They were wide, almost like he was on something. He didn't go to the aisles or the pharmacy counter. Instead, he just walked straight toward me and stood at the counter, not saying anything. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer, just stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment. Finally, he said, "I've been watching you." I forced a laugh, thinking he was just messing around. "Okay." "No, I mean it," he said, leaning in closer. I see you here every night." My stomach dropped. I didn't know what to say. I glanced toward the back, hoping my coworker would come out, but no luck. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "You shouldn't be here alone. Bad things can happen when you're alone." I was shaking at this point, but I tried to keep my cool. "I'm not alone," I lied. "My manager's in the back." He just smiled and walked out without another word. I locked the doors after that and didn't leave the counter until my shift was over. I never saw him again, but I quit a few weeks later. I just couldn't shake the feeling that one night he'd come back, and this time I wouldn't be so lucky. I used to work the overnight shift at a grocery store in a small town. There's not much to do at night, so we would get a few regulars who'd come in after midnight. Most of the time, it was just people who forgot something or wanted snacks for the next day. But this one guy, he was different. It was around 2 a.m., and the store was dead. I was stocking shelves trying to stay awake when I noticed a guy lingering by the entrance. He looked out of place, wearing a long trench coat, his head down, like he didn't want to be seen. I tried to ignore it and kept working, but when I glanced back, he was still there, just staring at me through the glass. I walked over to the register, pretending to check something, but really just trying to keep an eye on him. After a few minutes, he finally came inside. He didn't grab a cart or a basket, just walked slowly down the aisles, his eyes scanning everything but not picking anything up. I got this gut feeling that something wasn't right. He wandered around the store for a while, always staying within view of me, but never getting close. The whole time he kept glancing in my direction. My coworker was on break, so I was completely alone. He eventually came up to the counter with a single can of soup. I tried to act normal as I rang him up. "Will that be all?" I asked, hoping to keep the interaction short. He didn't answer, just stared at me, his eyes unblinking. The silence stretched on way too long before he finally handed me the money. As I gave him his change, he leaned in and said, "You work alone a lot, don't you?" My stomach dropped. "Not really," I lied. "My manager's in the back." He just smiled, a slow, creepy smile that made my skin crawl. "Sure they are," he said. He grabbed his soup and left without another word, but instead of leaving the parking lot, he stood outside, staring at me through the glass again. I didn't know what to do. I texted my coworker, telling him to come up front, but before he could, the guy finally walked away and disappeared into the darkness. I thought that was the end of it, but every night after that, for about a week, I'd see him in the parking lot, just sitting in his car, watching me through the windows. After that, I quit the night shift. No job was worth feeling like I was being hunted. This happened a few years ago when I worked the night shift at McDonald's. It was a pretty slow night, around 3 a.m., and I was working the drive-thru alone while my coworker was cleaning up in the back. The only customers we had were the occasional drunk people or truckers looking for a snack. But this guy, he wasn't drunk. He was something else. I was sitting by the drive-thru window, half asleep, when I heard the ding of a car pulling up to the speaker. "Welcome to McDonald's. What can I get for you?" I said, yawning. There was no answer at first, just static. Then, after a long pause, a man's voice said, "I'm not here for food." I laughed a little, thinking it was a prank. "All right, what are you here for then?" Another long pause. "I'm here for you." My heart skipped a beat. I looked at the camera, but the car was parked too far back to see anything. "Okay, very funny," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You want to order something or not?" The voice on the other end chuckled. "I've been watching you for a while. You shouldn't be working alone at night." I slammed the window shut and immediately locked it. My hands were shaking as I called my coworker up front. I didn't tell him the details, just that some creep was messing with me on the speaker. He brushed it off as a prank, but I knew something was off. About 10 minutes later, the guy finally pulled up to the window. His face was completely obscured by a hoodie, but I could see his eyes, dark and intense, staring straight through me. He didn't say a word, just smiled. I didn't open the window. He eventually drove off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. The next night, I told my manager I wouldn't work alone anymore. Something about that guy just didn't feel like a joke. I worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station for about 2 years. It wasn't the best job, but it paid the bills, and most nights were quiet. I never had any major issues, until one night when a customer came in, and things got weird fast. It was a little past 1 a.m., and I was the only one working. There was a guy standing outside the store, just staring through the window. At first, I thought maybe he was waiting for a ride or something, but after about 10 minutes, he was still standing there, not moving. I tried to ignore him, but the longer he stood there, the more uncomfortable I got. Finally, he came inside, but instead of grabbing something from the shelves, he just walked straight to the counter and stood there, staring at me. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't answer, just kept staring. His eyes were wide, unblinking, like he was trying to read my thoughts or something. I shifted on my feet, feeling more uneasy by the second. After a few moments of this unsettling silence, he finally spoke. "You've been here a while, haven't you?" I nodded slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah, been here all night." He grinned, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that makes your stomach twist. "I've seen you here before." I forced a nervous laugh. "Yeah, I'm here most nights." He didn't say anything else. Just kept staring at me for what felt like forever before he finally turned and walked out of the store. I was relieved when he left, but that relief didn't last long. About 10 minutes later, I looked out the window and saw him standing by the pumps, watching me again. I locked the doors immediately and spent the rest of my shift hiding in the back room, too freaked out to even go near the counter. I quit that job a week later. No paycheck was worth that kind of fear. I used to work the night shift at a 24-hour pharmacy, mostly dealing with late-night customers picking up prescriptions or grabbing last-minute items. Most of the time, the job was boring. But then one night, something happened that still freaks me out. It was around 2 a.m., and the store was completely empty. I was stocking some shelves when I noticed a guy come in. He was tall, skinny, and looked a little disheveled. Nothing too unusual for late-night customers, honestly. But the way he moved was odd, like he was trying too hard to act normal. He walked around the store for a while, not really looking at anything, just kind of wandering the aisles. After a few minutes, he came up to the counter with a random pack of gum and set it down. "Is that all?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer, just stared at me for a long moment before finally saying, "You shouldn't be working here alone." My heart skipped a beat. "I'm not alone," I lied. "My manager's in the back." He smiled, a slow, creepy smile that made my skin crawl. "Sure they are," he said, then handed me the money. I gave him his change and watched as he slowly walked out of the store. As soon as he left, I locked the doors. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, waiting. I never saw him again, but I switched to the day shift after that. No way was I going to keep working the night shift after that encounter. I used to work the night shift at McDonald's. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. We had a lot of regulars who'd come by during the late-night rush, mostly drunk college kids or truckers needing a bite. But one night, I had an encounter that still haunts me. It was around 2:30 a.m., and the usual crowd had thinned out. I was in the drive-thru window, half asleep, when a beat-up old sedan pulled up. The guy behind the wheel looked rough. Greasy hair, dark circles under his eyes, and a thin, unkempt beard. He gave off a vibe that made my skin crawl, but I brushed it off. "Welcome to McDonald's. Can I take your order?" I asked. He just stared at me for a moment, like he was sizing me up. Then, without a word, he drove past the speaker and straight to the pickup window. Weird, but not unheard of. I opened the window, ready to ask what he wanted. "Can I help you?" I said, trying to sound casual. Instead of ordering, he leaned closer, resting his elbows on the edge of the window. "You work here a lot, don't you?" His voice was low and gravelly, like he hadn't used it in a while. I nodded, instantly on edge. "Yeah, I'm here most nights." He smirked. "I know." That sent a chill down my spine. How did he know that? I didn't recognize him, but maybe he'd come by before and I just hadn't noticed. "You're always alone this late," he added, his eyes scanning the empty kitchen behind me. That's when alarm bells started ringing in my head. "I'm not alone," I lied. "My manager's in the back." He tilted his head like he was trying to figure out if I was telling the truth. "Is that so?" I forced a laugh, trying to stay calm. "Yeah, we're cleaning up for the night. Do you want to order something?" He didn't answer. Instead, he just stared at me, his gaze lingering on me a little too long. Then, without another word, he slowly pulled away from the window. I watched as his car circled the building, stopping near the exit. I didn't think twice. I locked the drive-through window and texted my coworker, who was on break in the back. I told him some creepy guy was hanging around and we needed to stay alert. We watched the guy sit there in his car for another 20 minutes before he finally drove off. For the next week, I kept seeing that same car parked in the lot across the street, just sitting there, watching. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. But after that, I made sure I was never working alone at night again. I worked at a 24-hour gas station on the edge of town. It wasn't the best job, but the night shifts were usually quiet, and I liked the solitude. Most nights, I'd get a handful of regulars stopping by for cigarettes or snacks, but one night was different. One night, I came face to face with something worse than the boredom. It was around 1 a.m., and the station was dead. I was restocking shelves when I saw a man standing outside the door. At first, I thought maybe he was waiting for a ride or just lingering for a smoke. But something about the way he stood, so still, so tense, made me nervous. After what felt like forever, he finally walked inside. He didn't grab a basket or head for the shelves. Instead, he came straight to the counter and stared at me. He was tall and thin, wearing a dirty hoodie pulled tight around his face. His eyes. I'll never forget his eyes. They were dark, wide, and filled with something I couldn't place. Something that made me instantly uneasy. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer right away, just kept staring at me, his mouth twitching like he was struggling to find the words. After a long, uncomfortable silence, he finally spoke. "You work here alone?" I froze for a second, then shook my head. "No, my coworker's in the back." Another lie. I was completely alone. He didn't seem convinced. His eyes flicked to the door behind me, then back to my face. "I don't see anyone." I swallowed hard, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "They're restocking the cooler," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you need something?" He smiled then, a slow, twisted grin that sent a shiver down my spine. "Just looking." He turned and walked down one of the aisles, his gaze never leaving me. I stood frozen behind the counter, my hand hovering near the phone, ready to call the police if he did anything weird. After a few minutes, he came back with a single pack of gum. He tossed it onto the counter without saying a word. I rang him up, my heart pounding in my chest. As I handed him his change, he leaned in close, his breath hot on my face. "I'll see you around." I didn't respond. I just watched as he walked out the door and disappeared into the night. For the rest of my shift, I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. That was my last night working the graveyard shift. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stayed, I might not be so lucky next time. I used to work the night shift at a 24-hour diner just off the highway. It was mostly truckers and people passing through who'd stop by for a coffee or late-night snack. But one night, I had an encounter that made me rethink working there. It was about 3 a.m., and the place was dead. I was behind the counter, refilling the coffee pots, when a man walked in. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were dirty, and his hair was matted to his head. I'd seen my fair share of strange customers, but this guy gave me an uneasy feeling right away. He sat at the counter and didn't order anything. He just stared at me as I worked, his eyes following my every move. I tried to ignore it, hoping he'd get bored and leave, but he didn't. After about 10 minutes of this, I finally approached him. "Can I get you something?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. He didn't respond, just kept staring at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. I took a step back, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Sir, if you're not going to order, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." That's when he spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I've seen you before." I frowned. "I don't think so." He shook his head slowly. "No, I have. I've been watching you." My stomach dropped. "Okay, you need to go," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't move, just kept staring at me, that same creepy smile on his face. I backed away and grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but before I could dial, he stood up and walked out the door, disappearing into the night. I quit the night shift after that. I never saw him again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. I used to work the night shift at a warehouse, loading trucks and sorting packages. It wasn't a bad gig, quiet, straightforward, and usually uneventful. But there was one night I'll never forget. It was around midnight, and I was alone in the back, loading up a truck for an early morning delivery. The warehouse was huge and mostly empty at that hour, so every sound echoed in the silence. As I was stacking boxes, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, expecting to see one of my coworkers, but no one was there. At first, I thought I was just hearing things. Maybe the sounds were bouncing off the walls or something. But then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the other side of the warehouse. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I grabbed a box cutter from the table just in case, and started walking toward the sound. As I rounded the corner, I saw him, a man standing at the far end of the aisle, his face obscured by shadows. He was just standing there, watching me. "Who are you?" I asked, gripping the box cutter tightly. He didn't answer, just stood there staring. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. I had no idea how he'd gotten in or what he wanted, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I ran back to the front of the warehouse, locked myself in the office, and called the police. By the time they arrived, the guy was gone. They never found out who he was or how he'd gotten in. After that, I transferred to the day shift. I wasn't about to risk another run-in with a stranger in the middle of the night. I worked the graveyard shift at a McDonald's for about a year, and it was mostly uneventful. The usual late-night crowd consisted of drunk people, night owls, and the occasional trucker. One night, though, it was dead quiet, almost too quiet for comfort. The only people working were me and a cook in the back, since no one ever really came through the lobby at that hour. The drive-thru was where all the action happened. Around 1:30 a.m., a guy walked into the lobby. He looked normal enough, wore a jacket despite it being warm out, had a backpack slung over one shoulder. I greeted him, but he didn't respond. He just sort of stood by the soda fountain, staring at the menu for way too long. After about 5 minutes of awkwardly waiting, I asked him if he was ready to order. Without turning his head, he just muttered, "Not yet." I nodded and went back to cleaning up behind the counter. The guy didn't move for another 10 minutes. By this point, I was feeling really uncomfortable, but I figured maybe he was waiting for someone. or just killing time. Finally, he ordered a coffee, and I made it for him quickly, hoping he'd just leave after. He took the cup, walked to a table near the back, and sat down. That's when things got weirder. He didn't touch his coffee. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, not moving at all. I glanced at him every now and then, but he didn't even blink. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the cook yell from the back that he was going on break, leaving me alone in the front with the guy. Great, an hour passed. The guy still hadn't moved. I was beginning to get seriously creeped out. I wanted to tell him we were closing the lobby, anything to get him to leave, but we were open 24 hours, and I couldn't just kick him out for sitting there. Another hour passed, and by now it was close to 4 a.m. The guy still hadn't moved or taken a sip of his coffee. I started wondering if something was wrong with him, but I was too freaked out to ask. Then, out of nowhere, he stood up. My heart skipped a beat, but instead of leaving, he walked up to the counter again. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He leaned in, his face inches from mine. "You should go home," he whispered. Chills ran down my spine. "Excuse me?" "You should go home," he repeated, then turned and walked out of the building, leaving his untouched coffee behind. I never saw him again, but for weeks after, I was terrified he'd come back. I quit a few months later. Something about that guy and the way he just waited. I'll never forget it. I work overnight stocking shelves at a grocery store. It's quiet most nights, especially during the week, which is why I like it. But there's one night I can't shake from my mind, and it made me dread going in for my shift. It was around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Super dead. Most of the time, we didn't even see customers until the early morning when people started coming in before work. My coworker and I were organizing the cereal aisle when I noticed someone lingering a few feet away. He looked out of place, like he wasn't sure where he was. Just standing there, staring at the shelves like he was lost. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, because it's store policy to engage with anyone wandering around. He didn't respond. He didn't even turn to look at me. I shrugged it off and went back to stocking, but something about the way he stood there gave me an uneasy feeling. The next time I looked, he had moved a little closer, still staring at the shelves, but now he was only a few feet away. I told my coworker, and she glanced over and joked, "Maybe he's deciding what cereal defines his life." We both laughed, but I kept one eye on him. Then, suddenly, he turned and started walking down the aisle toward us. He stopped right in front of us, looked directly at me, and smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was wide, too wide, like he was forcing it. Without a word, he reached out and placed his hand on my arm. I flinched and stepped back, immediately feeling a surge of panic. "You should come with me," he said quietly, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I pulled my arm away and backed up until I hit the shelf behind me. "No," I said, trying to sound calm, though my heart was racing. My coworker had already taken a step forward, but the guy just kept staring at me, that smile never fading. After what felt like an eternity, he lowered his hand, turned around, and walked out of the aisle. I didn't see where he went after that, but I didn't care. We stayed together for the rest of the night, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting him to come back. I reported it to my manager the next day, but they never found him on the cameras. It was like he just disappeared. I still get chills thinking about it. I worked the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store, mostly manning the register while my coworker did inventory. We didn't get a lot of customers late at night, just a few truckers or people on road trips. But one night, we had a customer I'll never forget. It was around 3 a.m., and the store was completely empty. I was restocking cigarettes behind the counter when the bell on the door jingled. I turned around, expecting to see someone at the register, but the guy was just standing there, near the entrance, staring straight at me. I greeted him, but he didn't respond. He just kept staring at me with this blank expression. After a few seconds, he finally started walking around the store, slowly, like he had all the time in the world. He didn't grab anything, just wandered from aisle to aisle. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just weird. But something about the way he moved made me uneasy, like he was watching me the whole time. After about 15 minutes of him wandering, I started getting really nervous. No one else had come in, and my coworker was in the back, out of sight. I decided to check on him. "Everything okay back here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond, just kept staring at the shelf in front of him. I decided it was time to call my coworker up front. But before I could, the guy suddenly turned and walked toward the counter. I froze. He didn't have anything in his hands. He hadn't picked up a single item. He just stood there, staring at me. "I need to go," he said quietly. "Okay," I responded, not sure what he meant. Then, without another word, he walked out the door and into the night. It wasn't until after he left that I noticed the tiny security camera sticker on the front of his jacket, like the kind security guards wear. We didn't have any security guards, and that sticker? It wasn't from any company I recognized. I used to work the night shift at a big box store, mostly doing stock and cleaning up before the morning rush. It was quiet, which I liked, but the parking lot at night was eerie. We always kept the lights on, but that didn't stop the occasional sketchy person from wandering around. One night, I was outside on my break, sitting by the employee entrance, when I noticed a guy standing by the far edge of the parking lot. He was barely visible under the dim lights, but I could see him moving, pacing back and forth. I figured he was waiting for a ride or something, so I didn't think much of it at first. But after about 15 minutes, he was still there, just walking in circles. It was strange enough that I decided to head back inside early. As I got up, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, and getting closer, I whipped around, expecting to see one of my coworkers, but it was him, the guy from the parking lot. He had closed the distance in seconds. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me with this unsettling grin on his face. "You dropped something," he said, holding out his hand. I glanced down, but I hadn't dropped anything. "No, I didn't," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. His grin widened. "Are you sure?" I turned and quickly went back inside, my heart racing. I told my supervisor, but by the time they checked the cameras, the guy was gone. I never saw him again, but I stopped taking my breaks outside after that. Something about him was off. I used to work the overnight shift at McDonald's during my college years. It was an easy gig, mostly dead between midnight and 5 a.m., save for the occasional drunk person rolling through the drive-thru. But one night, something happened that made me rethink taking those quiet shifts. It was around 3:00 a.m., and I was working alone at the front counter. The only other employee was in the back, prepping for the breakfast rush that would hit in a few hours. The lobby was locked, drive-thru only at this hour, but the front windows gave a full view of the parking lot. That's when I noticed him. A guy, maybe in his early 40s, standing at the edge of the lot. He was tall, lanky, and dressed in a dirty jacket that looked way too warm for the weather. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just passing by or waiting for a ride. But then, after a few minutes, he started walking toward the restaurant. He stopped right outside the glass doors and stared in. I could feel his eyes on me, even though I tried to ignore it. I didn't want to call attention to the fact that he wasn't supposed to be in the lobby area since we were closed inside. But after 5 minutes of him just standing there, I started to feel uneasy. Then he knocked on the glass. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I didn't want to go over there, but I also didn't want to leave him standing. So I walked up to the door and spoke through it. "We're only open through the drive-thru right now," I said, trying to sound polite but firm. "You can order there if you need anything." He didn't respond, just stared at me with this blank expression. After a few seconds, I started to back away, figuring he would leave. But then he knocked again, harder this time. I jumped and turned around, and that's when I saw him pull something out of his pocket. At first I thought it was a wallet, but when he held it up to the glass, I realized it was a small, crumpled-up paper with something written on it. I squinted, trying to make out the words, but they were smudged. He just held it there, pressing the paper against the glass with his hand, his eyes locked on mine. I don't know what made me do it, but I shook my head and backed away further, my heart pounding. I told my coworker in the back about the guy, but by the time we looked out the window again, he was gone. I never found out what was on that piece of paper, and honestly, I'm glad I never did. After that night, I switched to a different shift. Something about the guy's empty stare and the way he silently demanded my attention without saying a word still gives me chills to this day. Some things are better left unknown.